Now, the cool thing about working with Ben and Randy, and by the way, Jim Russell over here, Jim, would you stand up? Jim is a really awesome person in this conversation, too. He works more with the micropolitan areas in terms of talent, going back to where talent was produced. And so when I had a chance to get to know Jim a little bit, I said, I think the same thing happens in rural communities. We produce a lot of talent that leaves, and how can we attract them back? So we're thrilled to have you with us, too, Jim. But as we had this conversation, there's been a little bantering back and forth, kind of a gentleman's dispute, I guess I'll put it. And when I first got in contact with Ben and with Randy's help, they argued that we shouldn't really focus on working with young people coming back to rural communities because 2/3 of the people moving to rural communities are total newcomers. And my response to that was, because I've been working with young people for about 25 years and just know how important they are, is that I don't disagree with that. That's what the data says. But I got two answers to that. One, the reason 2/3 of the people are total newcomers may be because we're still doing a really poor job of engaging our own young people about opportunities to come back at some point in the future. And the second thing is that the work I do with young adults moving to rural communities is it only takes actually 1/3 of the people you're losing coming back to replace those people who are passing away or moving out. And the reason is because when a person comes back to a rural community, they tend to bring a spouse who's from somewhere else, and they tend on average to have 2 children. So lo and behold, only 1/3 need to be returnees. 2/3 can be newcomers. So it's really been kind of interesting as we have this dialogue internally, and we're thrilled now to have you join that conversation with us about what all this means. So has this been fun so far? To really get your arms around this? Yeah. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about youth engagement, and then we'll do a small group dialogue and then go on to the panel discussion. All right. So just a little bit of background about kind of how I come to this work. I grew up in a town of about 300 people on a family farm. Went away after high school graduation to the University of Nebraska, got a degree in ag econ, created my own emphasis in community development because it didn't exist back then, and then married a young girl from Los Angeles and moved back to my family farm outside of a town of 300 people after we were married about 18 months. And when I moved home, a group of people asked me if I'd be willing to run for school board. Okay, I was about 24 years old. At that time, I thought it was an honor, but now that I've heard Randy talk, I realized I was just off a little. So anyway, but we were in the process of closing the school and merging with a neighboring town, so that tenure lasted about 2 years. But it put me in a position to work with my community to buy my former school building and turn it into a business incubator. And I raised $1 million over 3 years to put a 22,000 square foot business incubator in a town of 300 people. Now, if you were sitting in state government or a foundation reviewing that funding request, you'd probably think I was maybe off a little, huh? But we argued that because we no longer had a school, we would become a regional resource. We weren't competing against other towns. People probably wouldn't move to our community. And long story short, and I'm not taking credit for this because I had another classmate that came home with a vision for Grow Nebraska. And if you know anything about Grow Nebraska, that's a cooperative that helps rural artisans, crafters, and now foodies to market their valuable products to urban customers and get paid literally what they're worth for the quality of what they produce. Well, that initiative has created 6,000, almost 7,000 jobs in rural Nebraska coming out of that incubator. Now, the only other use for that building in my hometown that we came up with was at a town hall meeting after we were going to close the school, and that was to tear the building down and sell the bricks as an alumni fundraiser. So you had two different visions of, let's create a business incubator, let's hook it up with technology, let's help these artisans and crafters market to urban markets, or let's tear it down and sell the bricks. Now, the day of the auction, there was one other bidder, and that was a farmer who wanted to turn it into feed storage, okay? Now, the reason I'm telling you that story, it's my story, you have your stories, because we did our little poll here and found out most of you moved to a new place. But all of us bring our experiences and our connections, our education to that community. And when a community will invest in that person's ideas, the outcome can be the difference between tearing a building down or having it be feed storage or creating 6,000 jobs. That's why engaging young people is so important. The other thing I want to address is the question about who are newcomers. And part of this has come about through our dialogue. Because I used to separate out the difference between a total newcomer and a returnee. But through my experiences, maybe you have this same kind of sense too. Returnees actually are very much like total newcomers. Because when you come back to a community, you're actually a different person, oftentimes. I hear rural bankers tell me that all the time. You know, I was kind of a hell-raiser in high school, came back to my hometown, I'm now the vice president of the bank, but everybody in town still sees me as that kid in high school who was causing trouble, and I can't break the stereotype, okay? So I think we can really treat everybody that's moving to your community in the past 5 years as newcomers, and we don't have to have separate strategies for returnees and newcomers, okay? The other thing that I think is so important is this work is really built all upon relationships. And Ben actually, by accident, illustrated that this morning. He told 2 stories, one about getting a voicemail from the Red Cross telling him he had been elected vice chair. And he said, I took that job because I'd been in Red Cross before, and it was okay, and I was glad to do it. The other story was about a Lions Club opportunity, someone who he probably hadn't met before saying, hey, you want to be on Lions Club? And he said, I don't know what it's about. It was the pre-existing relationship that caused Ben to say, yeah, I'm willing to serve in that role. So really a lot of the work we're doing with young people is about building relationships with them. And I want to share kind of how that looks. And then we're going to have our reflective questions really deal with how do you build more effective relationships. The first thing I want to talk about is the impact that young people have on the economic vitality of rural communities. Now, I work all across the United States with rural communities and do a little work in Australia, Canada. And we're finding these 4 trends are consistent everywhere we go. There may be different causes for it, but very consistent trends. The first one is a historical outmigration of youth. In some places, it's more chronic than others. Where I grew up in western Nebraska, I mean, we've been losing 70-80% of our young people since the Great Depression, basically an emptying out of the Great Plains. But in other places, it's high cost of high amenity communities, like in Hawaii. When I work with people over there, they say the reason we're losing our young people is because there's not enough jobs here, and if your family doesn't own a hotel or restaurant, really the jobs are better on the mainland, so our young people are leaving, okay? But everywhere we go, outmigration of youth. Well, I'm going to show you some data in a minute that shows you that about half of our young people would prefer to stay or come back to their community if they could, okay? So that trend's changing. Loss of farms and small businesses, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Well, again, a lot of young people are interested in business ownership as a career. So we can engage young people in addressing that issue, or coming back to the family farm or ranch, and maybe doing something different than mom and dad did, but building a business around that. Erosion of leadership capacity, that's a fancy way of saying we've got a handful of people in a lot of rural communities, as Randy said, in some places it's 3-to-1 ratio, that are doing all the work. And if we can engage these young people in leadership roles, we can begin to revitalize the leadership base. And the last one is generational wealth transfer. Again, some of you have been involved in foundation work and know this story well, but if you have chronic outmigration especially, and grandma and grandpa pass away and the kids aren't living there anymore, where does the wealth go? It leaves the community after the funeral, go down to the bank and ask for a cashier's check and withdraw the family estate. So again, we can attract more of our young people to stay or come back. We have a better chance of retaining some of that wealth. So if we had 2 kids and one stayed or come back, maybe we can retain half that wealth instead of losing it. And just as importantly, those young people can create new wealth over a lifetime that could be invested in your community's future. So all 4 of these major issues impacting rural communities, young people have a direct impact on all of them. Now let me just illustrate the importance of youth engagement and attraction here. Now, I'm not as scientific as Ben and Randy are. I do have 2 PhDs, post-hole diggers, but anyway. But I came up with this sitting on the tractor one day back on the farm, because it was the end of the 80s ag crisis, and everybody's saying, what are we going to do about outmigration of our youth? We won't have a future if we don't have more young people moving to our community. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, wait a minute, I'm the only one from my community and my family. My wife's from Los Angeles. We had 2 kids. We now have 4 children. I wonder what the impact is of an alum coming back to their hometown. So I pulled out the census data, and later on Randy actually helped me with this research. And we ran the data to find out just how many young people we actually had, how many married couples and how many people we were losing, and we created a formula to help a community actually begin to have a measurement tool to see how many young people does it actually take to stabilize population loss. So I'm just going to show you a real quick example. I know it's kind of hard to see. And by the way, in your packet, you've got a handout that has some of these charts in it that you can look at later. But in this particular county, pretty small place, has about 8,000 people in 1990. In 2000, it only had about 7,500, okay? So it was losing, about 6.5% of its population over a decade, which is about 51 people per year. But the youth population in this particular county, this is in Nebraska, almost a third is youth, age 18 and younger. It's not that we don't have a lot of young people, it's we lose too many of them, and they don't tend to come back. Okay, and so we ran this formula based upon this population demographic, and come to find out if you could attract back just an additional 15% of the youth in that county, you could begin to replace the 51 you're losing, because that exponential impact of people getting married from someone outside the community coming back and having kids. Now, if you have total newcomers, you're going to do a little better than that even. So they're all newcomers, okay? But this same county didn't engage in any activity to try and attract people, and so they continued to lose population, age in place, pass away, and get older and fewer. And so you can see that instead of losing 6.5%, now in the last decade, they were losing over 10%. So things are accelerating for them. 80 people per year instead of 51. The youth population's dropped from almost a third to just under 25%, 23.7. And the graduating class is now down to, 93 people per year. So now it takes twice as many young people moving to that community as young adults and families to stabilize population loss. So there is some urgency here in acting. If we continue to wait, depopulate, get older, at some point it gets harder and harder to do this with just youth. But the very positive message is that we are actually seeing more young people now make this move. When I started this work, I was really fighting a macroeconomic trend. Matter of fact, when I went home, every single adult in my community greeted me on Main Street, at church, at civic organization meetings, with exactly the same phraseology. It was almost like saying hi to me. And that was, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" The attitude in my hometown was to come home was to fail. Couldn't make it in the real world? Well, that's changing. I think those of us that live in rural communities really feel blessed to have what we have, and we look what's going on in the rest of the world. So we're not fighting those trends, and we're seeing the data show up that actually people are moving here. So the real question now is, well, how do we engage in that? How do we, help those people that move to our community become active citizens, entrepreneurs, valued employees, leaders? So what we do when we work with young people is we go in and do an assessment of youth attitudes and preferences. We've been doing this for about a decade. Nicole Slotchek's here from Holt County. That's one place in Nebraska that we've done this for almost a decade. So they're in this data set. I know you can't see this very well, but the green at the top is the national data. That's 40,000 youth that we've surveyed to date in communities all over the country. These are primarily in towns under 2,000 or 3,000 population. A lot of them are even smaller than that. And then just to contrast, the center one is Nebraska, and the very bottom is North Carolina. So you can't really get very much different than those two kind of places. And the first thing that you can see, even if you can't read it, is the consistency of data. That everywhere we go, we're finding these trend lines that are pretty consistent among young people about their attitudes. The first one is their attitude about living in their community as a young person. We use a Likert scale of 1 to 5, 5 being high. And so what you're seeing on the chart there is they gave our community a 4 or a 5. And a very good to excellent rating as a place to live as youth. And about 40 to 50% of young people say that they really love their community. Which is interesting because when you talk to a high school student, they say there's nothing to do in this town, right? But they love it when you talk to them in focus groups for the same reason we as adults love it. Sense of place, family, community, good schools, okay? And they're pretty astute even in the junior high age about some of those things. The second bar chart is, what do you plan to do after high school graduation? And you can see it's off the chart in terms of plan to go to some form of college or two-year tech school or community college, okay? So in our region, it's running about 75, 80% of youth tell us they plan to go to some form of post-secondary education. So what does that mean if we're talking to young people about retention? Some people have heard me say this many times in the past, but the only people that I know that want to be retained are attorneys. The message of retaining young people to youth and to their parents is, you're trying to hold me back. I want to go off and get an education. I want to see the rest of the world. I want to have those experiences. But the data also says at some point, if there was a good career opportunity available, I have an interest in maybe coming back here. About half our youth are saying that. Okay? And that's really what the rest of the data tells us. The one after the big line as far as planning to go to college is, do you plan to stay and return? And then we ask the question a different way, which is, how many of you picture yourself living in your hometown in the future if there was an opportunity to do so? And right at half, everywhere we go, of our youth are saying, if there was an opportunity, my preference would be to stay or come back to my hometown. Okay? Now, will they all do that? No. But they may move to another small community as well. The second to last one is about, do you own a business right now? About 12% of you say they are currently in a business ownership position, whether in junior high, high school. You may say, well, that's a low number, but in the adult population, only 10% of us are entrepreneurs. And then think about how busy young people are. So the fact that many, and it's stronger in our very small places. And the reason we believe that's happening is there aren't quote-unquote jobs in a town of 500 people or less. You're going to have to figure out a way to make your own money to buy that first car or save for college. And so in very small communities, we have more young people tending to think about business ownership as a way to make money. So if we can invest in that strategy, that reinforces that. The last one on the chart is really an important question, and it is, has any adult asked for your input on how to make this community a better place for young people to live? And overall, we're seeing about 30-35% of youth saying yes. In Nebraska, it was only about 25%. So what that really means to me is 75% of youth in this region are saying no. No adult has talked to me about opportunities to make this the kind of place that I would want to live as a young person. And still half of those youth want to live there. And almost half of them value it as a great place to live. So imagine what would happen if we actually started building relationships with our young people and communicating with them and exposing them to opportunities and investing in their ideas. Okay? So this is the baseline that tells us there's a huge opportunity with youth, but there's some things we got to do in order to really have impact. So that's the second thing I want to talk to you about, is how do you build an effective youth engagement strategy? There's one construct that's been very helpful for community leaders to kind of think about this, and we're going to have this be part of our reflective time as well. And that is, from a youth perspective, does my community do things to youth, for youth, or with youth? So in the first example would be like trash cleanup after the community barbecue. Now, there's nothing wrong with kids doing community service, but when they are left to go out and do that in the alley while you sit there and have coffee in the coffee shop, watching them out the window, you can kind of imagine the message that sends to young people. Or skateboard zoning. This isn't quite as big a deal as it was several years ago, but a lot of kids were skateboarding up and down Main Street because they didn't have a skateboard park. Well, grandma comes out of the grocery store on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock, and Johnny knocks her down on his skateboard, and now she's in the hospital. So in the next city council meeting, we have on the agenda to pass a skateboard zoning ordinance to prohibit skateboarding on Main Street. Now, from an adult perspective, that's perfectly rational. It's a public safety issue. But from Johnny's perspective, you've just taken one more thing away from us, okay? So it's really understanding the youth perspective. And then we have communities that have said, okay, we got that wrong. We're going to make up for it. We're going to take that vacant building on Main Street. We're going to put a new roof on it, buy a foosball machine, a mirror ball, and a jukebox, and we're going to open up a teen center. So Saturday morning, we have the big grand opening, ribbon cutting, and none of the kids show up. Darn kids don't appreciate anything in this town, do they? Well, you never asked them if they wanted to have a teen center. You just did it for them. Or how about college scholarships? That's a good thing. Why is that on there? How many of you, this is another exercise part of the program here, how many of you have some form of community-based scholarship program for kids that want to go to college? Okay, everybody's got one. Hands up, keep them up, keep them up. Okay, everybody's got one, right? How many of you use at least one of those to invest in a young person that wants to come back to your community? That's part of the criteria of the scholarship. Yeah, we got a poster child over here that's going to talk later. But yeah, we got a few, but not very many, right? We're doing this for our youth. The best opportunities are elsewhere. Go out, get an education, but don't come back. This is for you to go build your life somewhere else. Okay? What we want to get to is we're doing things with youth. Okay? We're having a discussion with our young people about their priorities and what investments we need to make to create the kind of community that they want to have. We're putting them in leadership roles with adults. They're doing community service. They're learning about entrepreneurship. They're doing apprenticeships with local businesses that need to attract a skilled workforce. And they're really becoming part of our whole community, not just the school district. Okay? So you might think about where's our community on that continuum, and how do we move ourselves more to a role of doing things with our young people? Well, even that's not enough to really get your arms around this. So as I worked with communities around the country, I saw a common theme. And that was that we had some communities that were doing an awesome job around entrepreneurship education or career development. Okay? Kids were learning a lot about owning a business. They were having a chance to find out about jobs in their community. But they were never engaged by the community leaders as being part of the community in making decisions about the community's future and creating the kind of place they'd want to live. So what I saw was the attitude of young people was that I've got to go someplace else to pursue that dream because I'm not welcome here. And then I saw other communities doing a great job with youth leadership. They had young people involved in civic roles and doing projects together, but they were never exposed to economic opportunities. So their mindset was, I love this community, but there's no jobs here, so I've got to go away. So I said, I wonder what would happen if we put those together. And then what if we had mentors that worked with those young people and encouraged the community to invest in those youth priorities? So this became this youth engagement framework that we've used now in communities all over the country to help them begin to kind of rationalize a youth engagement strategy based on local assets and resources. So if I was working with your community, the first thing I'd do is I would work with you to do an asset map around what do we already have around entrepreneurship, education, career development. How are we currently involving young people in leadership and community service roles? How are adults mentoring youth and investing in their priorities? And let's stand back and take a look at that. And so this really helped us to begin to define that there's a whole lot of great stuff going on with youth in communities. We've got 4-H and FBLA and sports and drama and church youth groups and on and on and on. Kids are busier than we are. But then when I asked the question, how is all that great work with young people connected to your community's economic development strategy? Usually it's not in any way. So we're doing all this great stuff and making all these investments, but it's really not connecting. So we use that along with the youth assessment data to begin to build an action plan for youth engagement that has really 3 basic steps. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to build a working group based upon some of those resource partners that we identified in the asset mapping, our key champions. We're going to go through the youth assessment and asset mapping process together. That's the first step. We're going to then, step 2, develop a youth engagement action plan that is a continuum of engagement from early childhood all the way through young adulthood with the various programs and resources we have in our community connected into that master plan. So now everybody can see how their piece fits into it. And the third step is we're going to integrate that youth plan with our community economic development strategy. So now if we're doing an entrepreneurship program with youth, for example, we're going to use our microenterprise loan fund. We're going to use our business coach to mentor those young people. We're going to get our successful entrepreneurs engaged with those youth. So these youth are fully integrated into the community development plan. And the last step is an alumni and newcomer recruitment strategy. Because if you've done all that great work with young people, but you'd never talk to them again after they walk across the stage to get their diploma, you're going to have very limited traction. And you're going to get to hear a great story out of Holt County and others about how that's being done in other places. So in a nutshell, that's how we do the youth engagement work. Real quickly, just a couple community examples here. It's really hard to see there, but I'm currently working in Phillips and Sedgwick County in eastern Colorado, out on the high plains, suffering from the worst drought in 100 years right now. And we've done the process I just described to you. And they have been able to leverage $10,000 in their Economic Development Board budget, $5,000 from each county, against another $217,000 now for a youth engagement game plan, which is pretty robust. I won't go into the details, but again, we did the same assessment with them that I showed you on the national basis, and that's what their lines look like. And here's the priorities that they're going to engage on starting in June here with the summer camp as the first activity with young people. They're going to do career fairs. The FBLA in the schools is going to work with the Chamber and Economic Development folks to identify career preferences through the FBLA program with the guidance counselor there at the school, and then identify businesses that match well with those opportunities so it's relevant. They're also going to do job shadowing apprenticeships based upon that. And then the other thing that they're doing, Nicole, you taught the whole country how to do this. Nicole came up with the idea several years ago. I'm probably stealing your thunder from later. But to go out and talk to her business community about what kinds of jobs they were going to need to fill in 5 years. And taking that very relevant data back into the school system and say, if you've got students that want to stay or come back here, here's specific jobs or skills that they're going to need to do that. So making this very tangible. So they're going to be doing that there. A youth leadership program with adults, and civic engagement activities. They're going to use their student council as their community outreach vehicle from the school. So the student council members who see themselves as leaders and are comfortable in that role will sit at the table with local leaders and develop projects for youth engagement. And then the student council members are going to go back into the school and find those young people that want to participate in the projects, don't see themselves as leaders, but certainly want to have a role in projects in the community. And I think it's a great way to build that bridge. And they're going to make some recreational improvements and hire a new rec director there too. The other one real quickly is Brookfield, Missouri. This is the poster child of the mailbox campaign. Becky Cleveland, now 8 years ago, came up with an idea to give mailboxes to the high school graduates, and other communities have used that, including Holt County. And this mailbox has the student's name on the side of it, and in the mailbox is a letter signed by all the community's leaders, and it basically says, we have been honored to have you as a member of our community for the past 18 years. We wish you the very best in the future, and we want you to know you're always welcome home in Brookfield. And now after 8 years, they've given away that mailbox to about 700 young people, and they're starting to come back home. Last year, at the May graduation commencement, the speaker was a young woman who'd come home as a pharmacist and bought out the local pharmacy, and she received a mailbox in the first year, 7 years ago, and talked to her graduating seniors about how important it was to get a mailbox and what that meant. The other thing the mailbox has done is now that people know they're going to get a mailbox at graduation, so the centerpiece at the dining room table after the graduation ceremony is reserved for the mailbox. And so now when you go over to the house and have the reception and you put your card in the mailbox, it just opens up a natural dialogue about, so have you actually thought about coming back to Brookfield? If so, what have you thought about doing? And how could we help you do it here? Okay? So that's just a picture of how they do that. Before I get to this, there's one other thing in the evaluation. I wasn't going to include it, but I wanted to just touch on it really briefly, and that is Ben said, and he's exactly right, it's really hard to define the market that we're going after. I mean, how do you find the person that said they played baseball at the field down the road, when they were a kid or something, But I do think that there are some steps that we can take in our communities to develop an attraction strategy that's effective. And so I'll just have you maybe jot these down if you're interested. And the first thing that we've learned in working with people that are thinking about moving to a rural community is they want a community to advocate authentic assets. Don't pretend to be something that you're not. But we have great things to be very proud of in our rural communities. Maybe you have a great school system. Maybe you have a great healthcare system. Maybe you've got a vibrant entrepreneurship strategy that's investing in people who want to start a business. Or maybe you got that housing stock that could help a person that's upside down in a mortgage in Detroit come home and get reestablished. What is it? What is the assets that you have? Second, who do you think would be most interested in what you have to offer? Who's that target market? Okay? So if you have great schools, young families with kids, right? Third, what's the brand and message that you're going to create around those assets that's going to be appealing to your target market. Fourth, how do you create a marketing outreach message? And we like to use 7 approaches in 7 different ways, meaning social media, alumni events, maybe a website, Facebook. What's it going to be that you're going to use to reach out to that market with your message around your assets? And the 5th one that so many communities fall down on is community ambassadors. People that when these people who are interested in your community actually come to visit or move to your community are proactively, in a positive way, engaging those newcomers into the community and making them feel like they're welcome and are actively involved in the community. And I'm not going to steal their thunder on that one because that's something that Holt County is just doing an awesome job of. So anyway, those are 5 steps you can take to begin to kind of think about how to create an attraction strategy based upon our experience.